Okay, so number one, you want to factor 5x squared minus 14x plus 8. And remember, when factoring, you want to make sure it's in descending order. Is this in descending order? Yes. What is the GCF? You got to look for the GCF also. What's the GCF? 1. All right, so then you're going to factor as two binomials. All right, now remember, we're doing trial and error, so that reverse FOIL. So you're thinking of FOIL, and it's reverse FOIL because when you did the FOIL on a previous worksheet, you were given the binomials and you FOILed it out, right? And you ended up with this. Now you're reversing it, so you're going backwards. But remember what we did first. We looked at the F first, the F part of FOIL. So we asked ourselves, what two terms multiplied together is 5x squared? Now this one's not that bad because 5 is a prime number. There's only one possibility, 5x and x, right? It does not matter where you put the 5x or the x. All right, now once we do the F, which part of FOIL do we go to next? No, we went to the last. Remember that? We went to the last. So we asked ourselves, what two terms multiplied together is what? 8. Okay, 8. In this case, it's positive. So always look at the last sign. If the last sign's positive, that means that these signs in here are the same. They cannot be different. They have to be the same. Because if they are different, what's the negative times a positive? A negative, and what you wanted was a positive, right? So they both have to be the same. I think this was yours from last class period. I've got to give it to you. Thank you. And they're going to be that middle sign. So what do they both have to be? Negative. So I'm going to have 5x and then x minus. 5x minus x minus. Now, what are the possibilities for 8? There's 2, 4, 1, 8, right? Yeah. Now, I'm going to go ahead and remember, just try something. Now, of those 2, 2, 4, 1, 8, what are you going to try? 2, 4. Now, when we looked at this, we also looked at it as well as this, negative 2, negative 4, negative 1, negative 8, right? Because that product is positive. But I know it has to be one of these. The pairs of numbers I use has to be one of these because when I add them up, they have to be what? The out and the inner have to be what? Negative. So it has to be one of these pairs. If it's factorable, it has to be one of these pairs. All right. We talked about the fact that, are you going to try using 2 and 4 or 1 and 8? 2 and 4. All right. Let's put the 4 here and the 2 here and see if that works. All right. If it doesn't work, you try something else. Now remember, don't stop there and say that's the answer. You got to make sure you're checking your work. So I know that the F is correct. I know that the L of FOIL is correct. What have I not checked? The outer and the inner. The outer and the inner have to add up to be this middle term. So what's the outer? Negative 20x. What's the? I said the outer. What's negative 20? So what's the inner this time? Negative 2x. When I add them up, what do I get? Which is not what I wanted. So that cannot be correct. So let's switch the 4 and the 2 instead and see if that works. So 5x minus 4 times x minus 2. So the F and the L is still correct because look, if I multiply the first terms of each binomial, 5x times x is still 5x squared. A negative 4 times a negative 2 is still positive 8. But this time, remember, you got to check down the inner. The outer now is negative 10x. The inner is negative 4x. And when I add them up, I do get a negative 14x. So that's your answer. So the answer is 5x minus 4 times x minus 2. So it was this pair right here, right? That was when that worked, this pair. All right, number 2. Suppose we had 6x squared y minus 3xy minus 63y. So 6x squared y minus 3xy minus 63y. What's the GCF? Is it just y? 3y? Okay, so the GCF is 3y, because 3 goes into 6, 3, and 63. All right, now the GCF this time is 3y. It's not 1, so you got to factor that out. So when I factor that out, I get 3y times. Now, remember, there are how many terms in the original polynomial? 3, so I better have 3 terms inside the parentheses. 3y times what is 6x squared y?
2x squared.
2x squared, right? 2x squared. 3 times 2 is 6. Y times x squared is x squared y. 3y times what is a negative 3xy? Negative x. Is that correct? Okay. No, negative x, right? Because you're taking out the y. If you put a y, you're saying y times y is y squared, which is not what this is. So always check by distributing. And then 3y times what is a negative 63y? Negative 21. Okay? All right, now remember, that's not the answer. You got to check to make sure that this trinomial cannot be factored. Or if it's factorable, you factor it. So let's go off to the side and figure out if I can factor this. All right, so do the two binomials. And then reverse FOIL. It's trial and error. Give me two terms whose product is 2x squared. 2x and x. 2 is a prime number, so that was easy to figure out. All right, 21 is not prime, though. Now, also keep in mind that 21 is really a negative 21. So that means that when I look at the last, when I figure out what two terms in here multiplied together is negative 21, one has to be positive, the other one has to be negative. All right, so there were, when we first talked about this, we actually put in the signs to begin with. But then we also looked at it in this way. Let's deal with the signs last. So let's kind of figure out, give me two numbers whose product is although I know it's negative 21, let's just say 21. So there's 7, 3, 21, and 1, right? So which one do you want to try? 7, 3? Okay, so let's put the 7 here to 3 there and see if that works. Now, all I'm doing right now, notice I didn't put any signs in yet. All I'm doing is just making sure that the order in which I have those terms are correct. What's the outer? 6x. What's the inner? 7x. All right, now listen carefully. I know that the last sign's negative, right? So that means that these signs in here have to be different. So that means that these signs are different. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative, right? So when I did this one, you see how I ended up adding those numbers? A negative 10 plus a negative 4, I got negative 14. Here I'm going to do what to those two? Subtract them. So what's 6x from 7x? X. Is that what you wanted?
Yes.
I really want a negative x, but I have that x, though, right? So that means that the large of these will have to be what? Negative. So which one's going to be negative? And this has to be positive. Okay? And so you just, then you put in the signs. So you see how that inner was negative 7x? That means that this sign has to be what? Negative, and this has to be positive. And now check it, though. What's the outer? 6x. What's the inner? And when I add them up, what do I get? Which is what you wanted. Okay? Now remember, we did talk about the fact that the last sign's negative, so one of these had to be positive, the other had to be negative. So in this case, that implied that that 7 had to be negative and 3 had to be positive. Okay? But what's the answer? Yeah, don't forget to bring down the GCF. So 3y times, and then this, 2x minus 7 times x plus 3. Okay? All right. Number 3. Suppose this time you had, let's say, 5x squared minus 3x plus 5. So 5x squared minus 3x plus 5. Again, let's do trial and error. In a little while, we're going to start talking about the AC method, but for right now, we're just doing trial and error. So it's in descending order. What's the GCF? 1. GCF is 1, right? And so then let's go directly to the two binomials and see if I can factor this. So we're doing reverse flow, we're doing trial and error. So let's do with the F first. What two things multiply together, what two terms multiply together is 5x squared? 5x and x. All right, now once I do the F of 4, where do I go next? The last. So I want two terms whose product is 5 also. There's only one possibility. 5 and 1, right? Now the last sign, look at the last sign. The last sign's positive. So that means that these signs have to be the same. And they both have to be what? No, not positive. Negative. Because the middle sign's negative. Now, am I going to put the 5 with this one? No, we talked about that good. We talked about the fact that if you put the 5 here, if I put a 5 here, that means I can factor out a 5, right? That would be x minus 1. Well, if I can factor out the 5 from here, that means I could factor out a 5 to begin with. And I couldn't, because this 3 is not divisible by 5. What was the GCF to begin with? 1. So I know I cannot put the 5 there. So I got to put the 5 here, and what here? 1. So let me go ahead and rewrite this over. So I know this has to be the 1, and then this has to be the 5. Okay? All right, now, am I done? Is that the answer? No, you better not say that's the answer yet, because all I've done was verified the first and the last. What have I not verified? The out and the inner, because I need that out and inner to be a negative 3x. What is the outer? Negative 25x. What's the inner? And when I add them up, I get negative 26x, which is not what you wanted. So I've exhausted all possibilities because the only possibility for 5 was 1 and 5, right? There's nothing else. So then you say the answer is prime. So this polynomial cannot be factored. So it's prime. All right, number 4. Suppose you had 4x to the 4th plus 2x cubed y minus, that's a y, minus 6x squared y squared. So 4x to the 4th plus 2x cubed y minus 6x squared y squared. All right, what do you think the GCF is? 2x squared. 2x squared. So since the GCF is not 1, it's 2x squared, I'm going to factor out the GCF first. So I get 2x squared times, all right, what are you left with?
2x squared plus xy.
Yeah, so 2x squared times 2x squared is 4x to the 4th, right? So use the distributive property to help you. 2x squared times what is a positive 2x cube y plus xy? Okay. And then 2x squared times what's a negative 6x squared y? Negative 3y squared. All right, so that's where I'm at. All right, now you got to take that trinomial and see if you can factor that further. Now this time, and we dealt with this before, you have two variables this time. So just remember how to deal with that. So 2x squared plus xy minus 3y squared. All right, so then let's go ahead and factor this if it's factorable. So FYL, so trial and error. So let's start with the f first. So what two things multiplied together is 2x squared? 2x and x. All right. Now the last term is a negative 3y squared. So I know that since it's negative, one of these parentheses will have a positive symbol and the other will be negative, right? One will be positive, one will be negative. But let's deal with the sign last. Let's just go ahead and deal with that last. So let's just look at 3y squared. What are the possibilities of 3y squared? There's only one. 3 and 1. 3y and 1y, right? Now, be careful. Don't just put a 3 and a 1 here. Because what's 3 times 1? 3, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted really a negative 3, but a y squared, though, right? So this really needs to be a y. Now, some of you have a habit of putting 1y. Don't put 1y. Just say what? Y. Just say y. All right. Now, I know that the last sign's negative, so that means that these signs are going to be different. All right. So first of all, I need to see if that's the correct order. What's the outer? 2xy. What's the inner? All right. Now, am I going to add those or subtract those? Subtract them. Why will I need to subtract those? Because one's positive, one's going to be negative. Right? So when I subtract those, do I get a 1xy? Yes. Now, all I got to do now is figure out, remember the large of these, which is 3xy, will take the middle sign. So the large of these has to be what? Positive. So that means that 3xy has to be positive, and then 2xy has to be negative. And then add them, though. Now add them. What's 3xy and a negative 2xy? xy. Okay. And now, so what that means is that the order is correct that you have it. You just got to put the signs now. So the inner is positive 3xy, and that means that this sign here has to be what? Plus. If the outer is a negative 2xy, that means this one has to be negative. And double check. What's 2x times a negative y? Negative 2xy. What is a positive 3y times x? Positive 3xy. Right. So I factored this correctly now, this right here. But is that the answer? No, because what else did I do to begin with? Yeah. So remember, that's a factorization for this trinomial, but that was not my original. My original was this one. So I'm trying to factor this. So you got to remember, you did factor out the GCF, so that's got to be part of your answer. So my answer then is going to be the GCF times those two binomials, 2x plus 3y times x minus y. All right, number 5. Okay, number 5, suppose you had this. Suppose you had 12x squared plus xy minus 6y squared. So 12x squared plus xy minus 6y squared. What's the GCF? 1. GCF is 1. So I'm going to go directly and factor this as two binomials using trial and error, FOIL. All right, so I need two terms whose product is 12x squared. Now there's several possibilities, right? There is 3 in terms of numbers. Let's deal with the numbers. There's 3 and 4. There's 6 and 2. There's 12 and 1. Correct? Mm-hmm. Which one do you want to try first? 3 and 4. So let's put it doesn't matter. I can put the 3x here or the 4x. Does not matter. So that takes care of the f, right? All right. Now, look at the last term. The last term is negative or positive? Negative. So that means that these signs in here will have to be same or different? Different. Because in order to get a negative here, you got to say a negative times a positive. But my last term is a negative 6y squared. So let's talk about the 6 for a moment. What are the possibilities for 6? 3, 2, 6, 1, right? And again, I'm going to, really, you see how you say negative 6? You would say something like 3, negative 2, negative 3, 2, because that's what we did at the beginning, right? Remember that? But I'm doing it a little bit different this time, just to show you there are different ways you can manipulate this, you can approach this. So of these two pairs here, which one do you want to try? 3 and 2. Okay, numbers close together in the number line. It doesn't always work out, but that's what you want to try first. 3 and 2. Is it okay for me to try this first? No. Good. Because that means if I did that means I could factor out a 3. Which meant that my GCF had a factor of 3, and it didn't. Because what was my GCF? 1. So I know it can be this. So I know then, if I do the F's first, I know then that the 3 has to go where? Right here, and the 2 has to go here. Now that still may not be correct. Trial and error. That's why we call it trial and error. But I'm still trying to determine if that's the correct order. What's the outer? 9x. What's the inner? 8x. Now, am I going to say 9x plus 8x, or am I going to say 9x minus 8x? Subtraction, right? Because the signs are going to be different. If the signs are the same, you would add them. If the signs are different, you're going to subtract them. So when I subtract them, 9x minus 8x, do I get 1x?
Yes.
Is that what I wanted?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did forget. What else did I forget to do?
Y.
The y. So that's one way to check and see if you got everything you need. So that should be a y right here, right? And that should be a y. Okay. All right. Now, again, when I did the last, I should have realized that because I would have asked myself 2y times 3y is what? 6y squared, although I do want a negative 6y squared. Okay, so I should say this is going to be 9xy and this is going to be 8xy, right? All right, and when I subtract them, do I get 1xy? Yes. All right, now this is where we talk about the signs now. The larger of these, 9xy, the larger coefficient, 9, is going to take the middle sign. So that means that 9xy has to be positive and 8xy has to be negative. And then that means that since my inner term is negative, that means that this has to be negative and this is going to have to be positive. And again, check. 3x times a positive 3y is what? 9xy. A negative 2y times 4x is negative xy. And when I add them up, I do get xy, which is what I wanted. And so there's your answer. That's your answer. So 3x minus 2y times 4x plus 3y. All right, and then in one of the worksheets, and you had this on a previous worksheet, let's look at this. You have 3x squared minus 13x plus 10. So if you notice that all the problems we've done with the trial and error, the leading coefficient was a positive number. Were any of them negative? No, none of them were negative. They're all positive. But here, I have the leading coefficient being negative. So I'm going to cover up that negative sign for right now, and then I'm going to ask you, if this was what I had, what would be the GCF? This right here. 1. All right, now, remember we dealt with the leading coefficient being positive. This time it's what? Negative. It's a lot easier to deal with, it's a lot easier to factor if the leading coefficient is positive. Well, since it's negative, and remember the GCF, if I cover this up, the GCF was 1, right? Okay, now I'm uncovering it, so now let's go ahead and factor out a negative 1. So factor out the negative 1 here. And now notice what happens when I factor the negative 1. So I'm factoring out the GCF of negative 1. If I factor out the negative 1, notice that my trinomial will then have a positive leading coefficient. Because negative 1 times what is a negative 3x squared? 3x squared. So see, you get a positive 3. Negative 1 times what's a negative 13x? Positive 13x. Negative 1 times what's a positive 10? Negative 10. And now go off and figure out if what this is factorable. So 3x squared plus 13x minus 10. So your two binomials. The 3x squared is the easy one. 3x and x, right? All right, that's the f. Now, once I do the f, I go to the last. So what two terms multiplied together is a negative 10? But let's just deal with the signs last. So let's just talk about 10 for right now. There's 5 and 2, and what else? 10 and 1. What do you want to try? 2 and 5. Now, at some point, you should be able to look at this and very quickly determine which works. Meaning where the 5 goes and where the 2 goes. Where do you think the 5 is going to go? The first parentheses or the second? Huh? Second? And then the 2 would go here. Now let's check. Let's see if that's a correct order. What's the outer? 15x. What's the inner? 2x. Now the last sign's negative, right? So am I going to say 15x plus 2x or 15x minus 2x? Minus. And when I subtract them, do I get that 13? Yes. Now, here's where you got to deal with the sign now. The 15x, 15 is larger than 2, so the 15x has to take the middle sign. So 15x has to be positive and 2x has to be negative. And now when I add them up, 15x and negative 2x, I get a positive 13x. So since the inner sign's negative, so the inner term's negative, that means that this is going to be negative, and then this would have to be positive. Before going on, check. What's the outer? What's 3x times a positive 5? 15x. And then the inner? What's a negative 2 times a positive x? Negative 2x. And when I add them up, I get 13x. But remember, that right here that I'm circling, that's a factorization for this. But was that the original problem? No. What did I do to the original problem? I factored out a negative 1, so that's got to be part of your answer. So the answer is going to be negative 1 times 3x minus 2 times x plus 5. Okay? So remember, we did factor out a GCF of negative 1, so make sure that negative 1 is part of your answer. And you can always think about, if I cover this negative 1 up, if I were to FOIL this right here, if I were to FOIL this out, checking it, I get this right here, right? But then this negative 1 says I got to distribute that. So a negative 1 times 3x squared becomes negative 3x squared. A negative 1 times 13x becomes negative 13x. And a negative 1 times a negative 10 becomes a positive 10. All right? Okay, so that was a quick review of trial and error. So you had 2 worksheets I gave you, front, back on 2 of them, right? So that should help you a little bit more with this. There is a third one